You know what? I was muted. Why the fuck was my mic muted? You can tell that I'm a little bit discombobulated this morning. Anyway, I'll try that again. My name is James Cole. I'm the owner of PayDirtDFS.com, and I didn't want to write about this fucking slate. So I'm going to talk about it instead. It's a quick little Saturday stream. We're going to do a little Q&A. Use the models over at PayDirt to talk through this slate. It's pretty good. It's not too bad, all things considered. I'll also use the new portfolio manager to show some things about the slate that I think are relatively important. And also just show off what I've been working on. But this is going to be pretty chill. I don't have a game plan here. So if you guys have any questions about players or situations or circumstance or anything like that, please do ask so I have something to do. I'll probably stream for 35, 45 minutes or so before I have to leave. We have a play date that we have to leave for at 12:15 Eastern. So without further ado, I guess I should probably share my screen. Also, thank you for muted and muted and muted. And good morning. Yeah, good morning to you too. I don't usually do Saturday streams. Well, actually, we usually do the Saturday stream at night, right? We usually do the slate talk going over the slate for Sunday. Today, I'm not sure if we were going to do the slate talk tonight. We might do slate talk tomorrow morning for Sunday, which it feels like people kind of like morning talks better anyway. I'm also really quick going to go post this in little operations Discord here. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and jump on. McBride, please do something today. Let's go check out McBride and his projections here. Secondary slate. I suppose I could look at this. Nah, fuck it. Yeah, I mean, McBride projects really, really well. For those of you who don't know, I say this all the time, but like I do a lot of work over at Fantasy Life, so I use their tools quite a bit. Let's see over the last couple of weeks for Mr. McBride here. I don't think that anything has been bad for him, so I feel pretty confident in that projection of 16. TPR of 8% in week 16 is quite a bummer. He only had 10% of the targets, but that's a blip on the map, right? Like 17, 14, 21, 25. He's been really, really good. I feel pretty confident that he's going to continue to be good. It all just kind of comes down to how efficient Kyler Murray is, I think, for the most part. Like that offense, it can run just fine. And the matchup is relatively good today, right? I mean, what, they're up against the Rams? Yeah, that game should be good. Actually, I was surprised to see that Matthew Stafford is only 5,700. That's a relatively cheap price for Matthew Stafford, especially with how condensed that offense is. I have quite a bit of interest in there. Let's see. Yeah, Matthew Stafford also in the contest sims, he has a pretty good edge at 6%. Projections think that Joe Burrow is going to be the highest owned. I think that Bo Nix is probably going to be the highest owned at 6,200. So I'll probably reset that a little bit after I do this stream. But Bo Nix looking like he's the most valuable. Even if you swap these, right, Joe Burrow ends up looking like a neutral play or up about 5%. And Bo Nix still has about an edge of 10%. But Matthew Stafford at 5,700, exposure rate of 27%. And this was ran on a medium above average field. So playing something like the Wildcat or something like that. But Bo Nix, I think, is still going to be the most valuable quarterback, 6,200, and then Matthew Stafford and Joe Herbert. Justin Herbert, -6%. Kyler Murray, -12%. Contest sims do not like Kyler Murray, only a 3% exposure rate in winning lineups. I have a little bit of interest in Kyler Murray, not like a lot, but a little bit. If I do play Trey McBride, I think that I would likely have a little bit of interest in Kyler Murray. But when you go and look at Kyler Murray's outcomes, he has just been generally awful in a lot of weeks. He averages okay, though, right? I mean, 17.7. How's he been over the last 6 weeks? Probably not great. Yeah. Averaging 15.8. I mean, it's okay. Lots of dropbacks, though. Good volume, 36 pass attempts per game. Just a really low A-dot. Completion percentage is high, but the A-dot is just really, really low. And he's not rushing as much as we need him to. Only 6% rush rate for Kyler Murray is really, really low. We need that to be higher if we're going to be interested in him. But all of that said, I think Trey McBride is fine. And especially as a flex play, he makes a lot of sense. Even with on a short slate, like if we just go, and this is something I've been doing for main slates for the entire year. But if you parse this down to wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs on the overall, look at the secondary slate here. Like you can see Trey McBride at 6,200 is the wide receiver running back, like the flex, the sixth best flex play. Has the second highest 4X rate behind Puka Nacua at 19.6%. And the ownership is only 22%. Like that's a really, really good play in the flex. I think I do really like Trey McBride in that asset. And when you just go, looking at running backs or wide receivers and tight ends, if you put it that way, then Trey McBride is the fourth best option, right? He's a wide receiver 4 on the slate, just behind T. Higgins, who's $700 more expensive, Jamar Chase, who's $2,000 more expensive, and Puka Nacua is $2,000 more expensive. Now, granted, you do have a pretty large drop from median from these guys down to Trey McBride, but if you were looking at this and you were trying to decide, do I want to play, T. Higgins at 36% ownership or Trey McBride at 22% ownership, I think it's totally fair to end up going with Trey McBride, right? Slate Talk's one of the best theory shows each week. It is the best theory show each week. Thank you very much. You like double tight ends today? It's funny. Most optimizers do. So one of the things that I did when I was running, this portfolio manager, one of the things that I did was I was uploading just like ETR optimals just to see kind of what the field would do. And when you just run straight up 150 ETR optimals, you end up with double tight end like a lot of the time. I guess I can probably actually go over and check to see. Can I do this? Let's see. I don't want to show all of the optimals. I just want to show you. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So kind of ignore this. I mean, you don't have to ignore this edge and win rate stuff. This is from another project. But you can see like in terms of medians. So these are ETR optimals. And in the flex, you have basically all tight end in the flex. Right? Gesicki, Trey McBride, Austin Hooper, Drew Sample. Like you have a lot of Mike Gesicki in the flex. You have a lot of Hunter Henry in the tight end. So I think that a lot of people are likely going to be taking this route. And it makes a lot of sense for people to take this route because when you look at the overall values for this slate, and we'll just add running backs in here. So this is looking obviously at Pater projections now, but you just don't have that much value. You have Kayshon Boutte, who projects as an okay value, but he's still way behind Hunter Henry. He's still way behind Trey McBride. Both of these guys project as considerably better values based on 4X rate. Austin Hooper, Demario Douglas, like you would have to eat these New England wide receivers in order to get away from using tight ends in the flex. You also have Marvin Mims, but his projection is really, really low. So it makes sense why people would end up on double tight end today, and especially why ATR would be pushing double tight end in the flex, and especially with a cheap tight end in the flex. Oh, motherfucker. Is it a good slate? Man, I don't fucking know. Let's go check. So I ran this on medium and above average. Let's take a look here. So quarterback exposures. I think that this is likely, like I said, I think the Bo Nix is probably going to end up in the 25% owned range. I think Joe Burrow is probably going to be in the 20% range. So I think that this is likely lockstep, right? Pretty heavily correlated between exposure rate and projected ownership. I don't think that Bo Nix will be high enough owned. I think that there will still be edge on him. I don't think that Matthew Stafford will be highly enough owned. I think that Joe Burrow will likely be a bit over-owned, and Justin Herbert and Kyler Murray will both be over-owned overall. So I do think that there is going to be some edge just based on quarterbacks. We can also go and look at running back exposure. So Chase Brown looks really, really good in the contest sims. 68% exposure in winning lineups based on medium above average field. Kyren Williams also has a high exposure rate, but is projected to be too highly owned, it looks like. That said, he's not near as bad of a play as J.K. Dobbins. So so long as you are avoiding J.K. Dobbins at 30%, a 30% negative edge, you're probably fine. There's probably plenty of edge just provided by that. That said, I'm not sure that J.K. Dobbins will be that highly owned. I do know that ETR really loves him, so he probably will be somewhere in the 30 to 35% owned range. But I do think that more people will be on James Conner, more people will be on Kyren Williams, Chase Brown. Chase Brown and Kyren Williams are going to take up a massive amount of the ownership on the slate. So I think that J.K. Dobbins is going to come in a little bit lower, but it's not going to cover this 10% exposure rate. That's way, way lower than we could possibly expect him to come in owned. I did get some questions also about Chase Brown. And so one of the things that I have been doing, and I'll bring up the Discord here because I have the screenshots that are, available. So yeah, we talked a lot about fucking coffee this morning, but I wanted to show something here. So this is a screenshot of the portfolio tool, right? Of this portfolio tool and the output of it. So this was based on just 150 ETR optimals. And what we can see is that the finish percentiles were relatively high, which is not a good thing. When you think about finishing percentiles, you want to be in the 1 to 5% range to win GPPs. Like that's kind of the range that you need to land, and then you let variance take over. So a 15% finishing percentile means that you would expect to finish in the 15th percentile of a GPP most of the time. If you break that out based on distributions, you're probably going to be somewhere between the 4th and the 30th percentile ish, right? Within a standard deviation of that. But it's still acceptable. Like it's still okay. You're going to win GPPs every once in a while with lineups like this. But I wanted to point this out because the vast majority of these from ETR is forcing in Chase Brown in optimals, which is fine. But when you remove Chase Brown from the optimals, what you end up with is finish rates or finish percentiles that are about 10% better. So on average, you're in like the 5 to 7th percentile of finishing rate, whereas with Chase Brown lineups, you end up with Chase Brown optimals. I'll point that out. With Chase Brown optimals, you end up in the 15th to 17th percentile on finishing rate. Without Chase Brown in optimals, you end up in the 5th to 7th percentile in finish rate. Now, that doesn't mean that the lineups end up being that much more valuable, right? Like you still have to measure how often they beat one or the other. But like the top optimal without Chase Brown from ETR again, and I'm doing this for a reason. I'm using ETR for a reason here. But the top optimal without Chase Brown over at ETR is 133.5. Okay. And that one is only 2 points less than the top optimal with Chase Brown. Like the optimal is 135. So giving up 2 points of median and removing a player that is likely to be 60% owned, that feels like a better route in a lot of different contests. For a player like me, who I only have somewhere between like 3 and 5 lineups, right? I want to maximize my win equity, not necessarily my cash equity. If you're building out a portfolio, you want to have a lot of lineups that have a good chance of cashing, and then a subset of lineups that have a good chance of winning the entire thing. You want to kind of spread out your win distributions. So that is to say that when we then go and look at this and see, oh yeah, Chase Brown has a positive edge of 11%. Yes, and that's awesome, and he's still really good play. But also understand that if you avoid the 60% owned player, you're only dropping 2 to 4 points in median expectation, and you're boosting your finishing position, your average finish percentile when that lineup does well, right? So I wanted to talk through that a little bit with Chase Brown. I think that he's still a terrific play at 7,600. He's well in play. He has the highest exposure rate in the contest sims by a long shot, twice as high as the next highest running back. But there is reason to fade him. There is reason to avoid him. Favorite stack, probably Denver stacks. Probably. Bo Nix has the highest exposure rate. It's either Denver or Ram stacks. I'm really not that big on Cincinnati stacks. I think they're going to be too expensive when considering Joe Burrow's price. Like if you just put Matthew Stafford versus Joe Burrow and you have that $1,500 savings, that's kind of the difference between getting like the stack that you want with your quarterback and not. Joe Burrow is just a little bit too expensive for this slate. That's the way that I view it. And I'm pretty sure that, Puka Nacua with the highest exposure rate of 52%, much higher than, Jamar Chase at 26%, basically double his exposure rate. I think that kind of speaks volumes to Ram stacks over Bengal stacks. Both are still viable. Like I said, Joe Burrow stacks are fine. He has like a neutral edge, a neutral to plus 5% edge. I don't mind it. But when you consider the cost savings that you get on a Ram stack, which is just as condensed as a Cincinnati stack and, should have the same ceiling, and you have it at less ownership, right? Because the projected ownerships on, somebody like Cooper Kupp at 21% versus T. Higgins at 36%. Like you just, when you put all these things together, Ram stacks just make a lot more sense. So Ram stacks are definitely going to be my favorite here. While we're on wide receiver exposures, let's talk a little bit about wide receivers. So if we sort this by edge, right, Kayshon Boutte has the highest edge at 12%, with Marvin Mims second highest at just about 12%. Both of them are undervalued, mostly because people are jamming in a tight end into the flex. So if instead of using a tight end in the flex, you use Kayshon Boutte or Marvin Mims Jr. at 15 to 20% owned, those guys are just more valuable flex plays, I think. And also they're more valuable because Marvin Mims wants to be paired with Bo Nix, and nobody is going to be using Drake May, right? The thing about these cheap wide receivers is you want to play them when they're not popular. You really prefer to play them when they have lower ownership like they do today. And also, somebody like Kayshon Boutte, you're fine with playing him today in a New England stack, even if New England projects badly, because you're not counting on him for volume. Like if he was 5,500 or something like that, if he was a mid-priced wide receiver that needed some volume to get there and win the slate, you wouldn't want to eat that. But on a 3-game slate, if somebody is going to be probably something like 15 to 20% owned, if not lower, I think that Boutte could end up being lower than that, right? Especially when we're considering the raw upside, not necessarily the value, because we're not playing Kayshon Boutte because we think that he's a good value. We're playing him because he could catch like a 60-yard touchdown, and that's well within his range of outcome. Same thing with Marvin Mims Jr. Both of these guys are the exact same play. When you are considering playing a cheap wide receiver, it's kind of perfect for a 3-game slate to do it with these guys, where all you're hoping for is catching lightning in a bottle and passing 80% of the field that has a tight end that has a median expectation and a range of outcomes of like 8 fantasy points to 12 fantasy points. Kayshon Boutte has a range of outcomes that is like 7 fantasy points to 15 fantasy points, right? Like the distribution is just much wider on Boutte and Mims. So those guys make a lot of sense, I think, as one-offs. I don't necessarily like them as part of stacks. Marvin Mims is fine in a Broncos stack, but I wouldn't be looking to stack Drake May with Kayshon Boutte. I think that Kayshon Boutte just makes for a better flex play rather than the tight ends that people are going to be trying to jam in. I just don't think that it makes a lot of sense to be jamming in tight ends, even though it's fine. Like if you look at flex exposures here, tight end ends up in the flex 312% of the time. The average projection is 116. Average fantasy is fine. Like it all is fine, but the ownership is higher on tight ends in the flex. And wide receivers in the flex, I think, just have a little bit more upside. So that's my thing on wide receivers here. Puka Nacua is the most valuable wide receiver on the slate. He has the highest projected ownership, but I don't think I care. When we're looking at negative edges here, it's mostly Jamar Chase and Ladd McConkey. Ladd McConkey, I think, is probably a bit better, only because he's 6,600. Like I think that you can justify him a little bit better than trying to justify something like Jamar Chase. Like I said, I'm mostly just off of Cincinnati stacks. I might be off of Cincinnati altogether if I fade Chase Brown, but I don't think I necessarily need to fade Chase Brown. Like I said, he's a fine play. He's okay, so long as you're finding your edge elsewhere. And also, if I wanted to go over here and do this, I could say, let's see, secondary slate. So if I was going to be building this out, I said that I like Denver stacks. So we'll start with Bo Nix. Then we're going to bring in Cortland Sutton. And let's just go ahead and throw in Mims here, right? I'm okay with Chase Brown. It's fine with me. And then at tight end, let's see, Trey McBride. Actually, no, let's build a Ram stack here. So let's go with Matthew Stafford with Mr. Puka. And I do like Trey McBride. Fine with that. And then let's go ahead and go Cooper Kupp with Mims and say Kayshon Boutte. What does that leave us with? Levex a little bit low. Ownership is 199%. But I mean, we have about 8K to get there. If we choose, say, I don't know, we think that early game is really going to suck. This gives me 5,700 for a running back. Who can I play here at 5,700 for a running back? By the way, if you guys didn't know that you can use this quick builder, it's a pretty cool little tool. I don't know how many people know about that or use it, but it's pretty cool. Hey, Ramondre Stevenson. Okay, so this is a really nice lineup, actually. So this is 50K. Total median is 124. Total ownership is 237. But what we end up doing here is we have the New England Patriots with Ramondre Stevenson. We have Stafford, Puka, Kupp, bring it back with Trey McBride. And then we have Marvin Mims and Kayshon Boutte for the upside that both of those guys have. And Mims can play against Chase Brown as well as secondary correlation. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good lineup right there. I'm not sure that I will enter it, but if somebody else wants to enter it, then fucking be my guest. There's 300 people that are watching, so I don't know that it'll be duped a whole bunch of times, but that's a pretty good lineup. You could also, instead of playing Ramondre Stevenson, end up playing Javonte Williams if you wanted to, or Antonio Gibson or something like that, but you're not going to be able to get both Chase Brown and Kyren Williams in a lineup like this, right? You would have to come way down at tight end to, let's see, $2,000 I think would give me the room that I would need to. You could go Hunter Henry instead of Trey McBride and then end up with Kyren Williams, I think. Yeah, that gives you 49.8. Total ownership is really, really high on this one, though. So I probably would prefer the other one. But yeah, that's probably how I would build a Ram stack. Let's see if we can find anything else here. Let's go take a look at tight end exposures. Austin Hooper has the highest edge at plus 5%. Exposure rates are pretty spread out, all things considered, for tight end. 17% for McBride, 17% for Hunter Henry, 15% for Hooper, 13% for Gesicki. Largest negative edge is 6% on Gesicki, but like you can make up 6% negative edge basically anywhere. That's not hard to do whatsoever. Negative 3%, like you can play any tight end that you want. I'm not going to worry about these edges. So when we're looking at these overall exposures, guys that you likely should stay away from here. And as I'm finishing this up, feel free to put some questions in the chat. I will answer them, towards the end of this as I close this out. But we got about 5 minutes left before I jump off this and get ready to go to this little play date. Worst play on the slate is probably J.K. Dobbins. Projected ownership, 40%, exposure rate is 10%. Even if you think he comes in at 20% own or not at 30% ownership in large field, he's still the worst play on the slate. He's just on par with Kyren Williams, who also looks drastically overowned. That being said, Kyren Williams at 19%, I think you can make that up in different ways, right? Like you can make that up by staying off of Cincinnati stacks. You can make it up by staying away from Jamar Chase simply, right? Like when you have a negative 19%, all you have to do is then say, okay, so who is plus 19%? Nobody. So I have to have some combination of things, right? Like I have to make sure that I have Puka Nacua and Kayshon Boutte to cancel out the negative 20% from Kyren Williams. That being said, one of the reasons why Kyren Williams is negative 19% is because he's pretty expensive. There's other running backs you can utilize. And then Jamar Chase and Ladd McConkey. I'm fine with Ladd McConkey at negative 12%. Like I said, we can make that up. The problem is that you end up with, do I want to play Ladd McConkey or do I want to play somebody like Trey McBride? And I think that I probably prefer Trey McBride, especially if I'm going with a Ram stack. After that, you have a whole bunch of guys who are relatively neutral. Anything negative 10% or better, I'm fine with. Like it's really these guys in the double digits that I worry about. We'll sort this by edge positive. So Boutte, Mims, Chase Brown, Javonte Williams, Puka Nacua. These guys are all the highest positive edges. Javonte Williams at 14% seems like kind of a sick play, but I do want to kind of go look at game logs for running backs for the Broncos because they've just been fucking assholes for the last couple of weeks. So the big thing when we're looking at this, I mean, Javonte Williams still has a significantly high route participation, 40%, much higher than any of the other running backs, even though his outcomes have not been great. He only had 19% of the rushing attempts. Jaleel McLaughlin had 15% in week 15. Audric Estime, however the fuck you pronounce this guy's name, 43% last week. The big thing here is the route participation is considerably better for Javonte Williams, and he continues to get like a 10 to 13% target share, whereas this dude is not going to get basically any targets. He has hardly any route participation at all. So Javonte Williams at really, really low ownership actually does make a lot of sense on the slate at 5,400. There's no reason why he wouldn't be able to be involved in the offense in a way that would make him valuable. Chase Brown, talked about him at length. I think that Chase Brown is a totally fine play. I think that your average finishing percentiles are going to be considerably higher if you end up fading him. Now, if you do fade him, what you end up doing is halving. You basically, if you're going to fade Chase Brown, you have to stack the Rams so that you can end up getting not only away from, so here's the way that it goes. If you fade Chase Brown, you end up stacking the Rams so that you get away from Kyren Williams, who is already a negative edge, and it forces you into playing Javonte Williams and somebody like Ramondre Stevenson, right? If you stack the Rams, you can kind of force yourself into paths that still have positive expected value and positive edge based on exposure rates and projected ownership. Or you could just play Chase Brown, right? And you're going to get away from Kyren Williams that way. But I think the big thing is staying away from Kyren Williams in both of those scenarios. So I would say that Kyren Williams is probably a pretty bad play today. And then the other plays here are just Kayshon Boutte and Marvin Mims. I think that they make for better flex plays than a lot of the tight ends. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and ask now or forever hold your peace. I'm going to be out of here in about 15 minutes. So while you guys are asking questions, I'm going to go kind of show how this works. So one of the cool things that you can do is you're going to be able to upload, lineups, testing port, and it's going to tell you the lineups that get entered, right? And then you're going to be able to go in and say, here's the slate projections. It's going to do name matching analysis. So if there were any players that didn't match here, we'll upload a file that I know has projections that don't match. Actually, do I have a file that has projections that don't match? I don't remember. This one. So, just kidding. Got to clear these. Clear data. So let's go ahead and do testing portfolio, and then we'll do this one. So if there are names that don't match, like none of the defenses in this file match, then it'll tell you the different projected names that have the highest match. And then you can go through and it's going to replace them in your projections file for you. So you don't have to go through the trouble of doing name matching. You go through, do all of those. And then you go over here to the manage portfolio. What you'll end up seeing is the dupes as well as the finishing percentiles for all this stuff. And you can just sort this by finish percentile. And you can see here's a whole bunch of lineups that have really, really good finishing percentiles and low dupes, right? Another thing that you can do is if you want to keep this sorted by median, you can also say, I only want to see lineups that have a top 10th percentile finishing rate. And then you can go ahead and look at them again, right? So here's all the lineups sorted by median that have a really, really high or low finishing percentile. And these are kind of from a basic idea of the lineups that I would want to play. Let's see some questions. All right. Sounds like Sin is fade or overstack. Yeah. I think you could do an overstack. I think you could do Denver plus Cincinnati by a lot. But for the most part, I'm just not interested in stacking Cincinnati on this slate. Doesn't feel like it would be all that valuable to me. Ram stacks and Denver stacks just make a lot more sense. And even Arizona stacks, I think, are not the worst thing in the world. If playing Burrow, do you avoid Jamar Chase or Chase Brown or play both? If I'm playing Burrow, I am very likely just stacking straight a QB +2 of Burrow plus Chase Brown plus T. Higgins. Now, the key there is that I would be fading Chase Brown. And what that ends up doing, when you look at it through that lens, you end up fading the 60% on players. So your win equity skyrockets, right? At that point, your average finishing percentile is probably something like, the 5th percentile or something like that. So even though you have negative edge based on projected ownership and exposure rates on Chase Brown and T. Higgins, you have positive expected edge based on Joe Burrow, who has a higher exposure rate than his projected ownership, and your finishing percentiles are very high. So what that ends up doing, we can go back to this one here, right? What that ends up doing is when you sort by edge, you have things like this, where the win rate is lower, 2% or something like that. But even though the win rate is lower, the finishing percentile is 1.48%. And this may or may not be a stack for Joe Burrow or something like that. I'm not sure, but just trust me on this. If your expected win rate is lower, that's okay if your expected finishing percentile is also justifiably lower, right? So this finishing percentile, if this was, say, 15%, then this lineup sucks now. But because the finishing percentile is 1.48, even though the win rate is relatively low, you still end up with a positive edge on the lineup overall. That's an important concept. So with Cincinnati stacks, if you fade Chase Brown, that's still a fine lineup, because even though you win less of the time, your finishing percentile is lower, and thus your edge is maintained. So that's the way that I would play Cincinnati stacks today. Cooper or Puck, anytime touchdown? Oh, shit. Probably Puka. Well, actually, go find out. I suppose I could also go check my own projection models. Go check NFL betting models here. That's a pretty good question. I never get asked questions like that. So Puka, let's sort this by receiving touchdowns. I have Puka for 56% score touchdown. I have Cooper Kupp for not that, 37%. So definitely Puka. I'll take Puka on that. About 20% better chance to score a receiving touchdown. Also just have Puka overall as a better play. He's just been a baller. All right, and then final question here. Is Ladd McConkey and J.K. Dobbins in the same lineup? Okay, it's Ladd or Higgins, and I have Chase Brown already in my Bo Nix stack. Yeah, that's probably fine. I just think that J.K. Dobbins is a bad play overall, so I probably just would not play him. I would prefer to go, if you want to play Ladd McConkey, I'd prefer to just go with Ramondre Stevenson or Javonte Williams. I think that both of those guys are just better plays than J.K. Dobbins in a vacuum. Overall, it just makes more sense for me to play those guys. So anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in. More people than I thought would tune in for this one. If you guys have any more questions, you can hit me up over on Twitter. You can join the Discord if you'd like. Discord is free to join. You can just click that link and it'll take you to the Discord, or you can follow me over on Twitter at paydirt_DFS, or you can find all of these models and all this information over at paydirtdfs.com. My name is James McCool. This has been a fucking Saturday talk because I didn't want to write. So I'm going to go upload this to YouTube. You guys can rewatch it. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you all.